The train car went dead silent. Every eye followed the conductor's bony finger as it pointed straight at the woman in seat 14B. His name was Harvey Brennan, and with that one simple gesture, he was about to shatter a woman's world. But what happened next would prove that sometimes when your world shatters, you find out it was a cage all along. Before we dive into this, do me a favor and drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. And if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what I've got lined up for you is something you won't want to miss. All right, let's get back to it. The morning sun in Denver was sharp and cold. It sliced across the platform, making long, dark shadows that seemed to cling to Margaret Rose Whitfield's ankles as she walked. She clutched her satchel, the leather worn smooth over the years, and headed for the gleaming silver passenger car of the Mountain Star Express. At 28, Margaret had learned to build a fortress of quiet dignity around herself. It was the only way to survive the whispers and the sideways glances that trailed her like a ghost. But today was different. Today she was finally going home. Copper Creek, Montana. The name itself felt like a warm blanket. 3 long years she'd spent in Denver, hunched over a sewing machine in a cramped, dusty shop. 3 years of saving every last penny, skipping meals, mending her own clothes until they were more patched than fabric. All for this one train ticket. This trip wasn't just a visit. It was a pilgrimage. Her younger sister Emma, the bright, shining star of her life, was getting married. Margaret had to be there. She had to see Emma walk down the aisle and meet the rancher who had finally captured her wild heart. As she neared the train car, she felt the familiar shift in the air. Passengers, well-dressed and self-assured, would look up. Their eyes would land on her, and then they'd dart away as if they'd seen something they weren't supposed to. It was a dance she knew all too well, the dance of avoidance, the choreography of quiet judgment. She knew her dress, a deep blue wool she'd sewn herself, was perfect. The tailoring was impeccable. The press was sharp. But she also knew that to some people, things like that didn't matter. They only saw what they wanted to see. And then she saw him, the conductor, Harvey Brennan, a thin, sour-looking man with silver hair and spectacles that seemed to magnify the disapproval in his eyes. He'd been working the rails for 32 years, and he had a face that said he'd hated every single one of them. Margaret held out her ticket. He barely glanced at it, his eyes fixed on her, cold and hard. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a good deal louder than it needed to be, "I'm going to need to see some identification with that ticket." The platform seemed to tilt. Other passengers, pretending not to listen, suddenly went very still. Margaret's fingers fumbled in her satchel, her cheeks burning hot. "Of course, sir. Here you are." He took her papers and made a show of examining them, holding them up to the light like he was checking for counterfeit bills. He was performing, and the whole platform was his stage. "Miss Whitfield," he announced, his voice ringing with false authority, "it says here you purchased a standard seat ticket." "Yes, sir, that's correct." He shook his head slowly, a nasty little smile playing on his lips. "Well, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about the seating arrangements." A few people were starting to gather now, their curiosity getting the better of their manners. A woman in a feathered hat whispered something to her husband, and the wind carried the words to Margaret's ears. How dreadful for her. "You see," Harvey continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "the standard seats are designed for, well, for passengers of an average size." The words hit her like a slap. She felt the heat in her face intensify, but she held her voice steady. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "I assure you, sir, I will fit perfectly fine. I've traveled by train many times before." Harvey just shook his head, enjoying every second of her humiliation. "I'm afraid I can't allow you to board, miss. Company policy is very clear. Passengers who cannot fit comfortably in a single standard seat must purchase 2 tickets. It's a matter of safety and comfort for everyone on board." The world began to feel fuzzy around the edges. "But I only have 1 ticket. I only need 1 seat." Her voice started to shake, and she hated herself for it. "I've made this journey on other lines. There's never been a problem." "Well, this isn't some other line," he sneered. This is the Mountain Star Express. We have standards. He thrust her papers back at her. I suggest you go to the ticket office and purchase an additional seat. The next train to Montana leaves on Thursday. Thursday, Emma's wedding was on Saturday. Disbelief warred with a rising tide of panic. She thought of the months of scrimping and saving, the extra hours, the gnawing hunger she'd ignored. Buying a second ticket wasn't just embarrassing, it was impossible. Sir, I don't understand, she pleaded, her voice cracking. My ticket is valid. I have a right to be on this train. His face hardened into a cruel mask. Ma'am, you're holding up the boarding process. I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the train car. Now. The crowd had grown. Dozens of eyes were on her. She saw pity in some, morbid curiosity in others, and in a few she saw a chilling flicker of satisfaction. They were enjoying her pain. She wanted to vanish, to sink right through the wooden planks of the platform and disappear forever. Please, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. My sister's getting married. I just want to go home. Harvey was unmoved. Rules are rules, miss. Now move along before I have to call for assistance. Tears finally welled in her eyes, hot and shameful. She was about to turn away, defeated, when a voice cut through the murmuring crowd. It was a deep voice, calm and steady, but with an edge of steel that made everyone go quiet. Excuse me, conductor. What exactly seems to be the problem here? Every head on that platform snapped around. A man was moving through the crowd, and people just seemed apart for him, like the sea before Moses. He was tall, wearing a black hat tilted just so, a clean white shirt under a leather vest, and boots that looked like they'd seen hard work but were polished to a shine. He moved with a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. His green eyes were intense, and they swept over the scene, taking in the sneering conductor, the gawking crowd, and Margaret, standing there with tears in her eyes, clutching her useless ticket. This was Jake Morrison, a man who owned one of the biggest cattle ranches in Colorado, though you'd never know it by his demeanor. He wore his success like a comfortable old coat, not a flashy new suit. He'd been in Denver finalizing a massive contract to supply beef to the railroad, the very same railroad whose employee was now making a public spectacle of a paying customer. Harvey Brennan puffed out his chest, annoyed by the interruption. This is railroad business, sir. It doesn't concern you. Jake's gaze shifted from the conductor to Margaret. He saw her distress, the trembling of her hands, the shame in her eyes. He'd only caught the end of the conversation, but it was enough to make his blood boil. I believe it does concern me, Jake said, his voice still dangerously calm. It concerns any paying customer when another is being treated unfairly. It sounds to me like this lady has a valid ticket, and you're refusing her passage. Harvey's face started to turn a blotchy red. The lady does not meet our seating requirements, sir. Company policy clearly states. I know what company policy states, Jake cut in smoothly. I also happen to know that the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 requires all common carriers, including railroads, to provide service to any paying customer who conducts themselves in an orderly and respectful manner. This lady appears to be the very definition of orderly and respectful. You, on the other hand, he let the sentence hang in the air. Margaret stared at this stranger. Who was he? Why was he doing this? She'd learned a long time ago not to expect help, especially not from a man who looked like he could have anything he wanted in the world. Men like that didn't see women like her. Sir, I don't know who you think you are, Harvey sputtered, but I am the conductor of this train, and I will not be told how to do my job. Your job, Jake replied, his voice dropping a little, is to ensure the safe and timely departure of this train. It is not to publicly humiliate a woman for your own amusement. The tension on the platform was so thick you could taste it. The circle of onlookers tightened, their whispers ceasing. They were watching a showdown. Harvey, realizing he was losing control, tried a different tactic. Look, mister, if you're so concerned about the lady's comfort, why don't you solve the problem? A second ticket is $12. He said it with a smirk, certain this stranger wouldn't part with that kind of money for a woman he didn't even know. Jake didn't even blink. He reached into his vest, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and counted out $12. He held the bills out to Harvey. There, he said, Problem solved. Margaret gasped. No, sir, please, you can't. I can't accept. But Harvey was already snatching the money, his face a mask of fury. His little power trip had been ruined. Fine, he snapped, but she'll have to take seats 14B and 14C. That won't be necessary, Jake said, his voice as cool as a mountain stream. The lady can have my seat. Harvey's jaw dropped. Your seat? That's what I said. I'm in the first-class car. Seat 3A. She can have it. I'll take her seat in 14C. Now Harvey was truly flustered. This was completely outside the rules, outside of anything he'd ever encountered. Sir, you can't just... There are regulations. You can't give away a first-class ticket. Jake raised an eyebrow. Is there a regulation that prevents a passenger from inviting a guest to sit with them? Because as of this moment, Miss Whitfield is my guest for this journey, and I believe I'll join her in the first-class car to make sure she's comfortable. I'll just stand if there aren't enough seats. He turned to a stunned Margaret and, in a gesture of pure, old-fashioned courtesy, offered her his arm. Miss Whitfield, if you'll allow me. Margaret looked from this impossible stranger to the fuming conductor, and then at the faces in the crowd, and she saw something new. The pity was gone. The cruel satisfaction was gone. In their place was a look of grudging, and in some cases, open admiration. Harvey Brennan, defeated and furious, had no choice but to step aside. He muttered something about the schedule as Margaret, her head held high, took Jake's arm and allowed him to escort her up the steps and onto the Mountain Star Express. She didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just stepping onto a train. She was stepping into a whole new life. The first-class car was like a different world. It was a palace on wheels, rich burgundy velvet, polished mahogany, and brass fixtures that gleamed like gold in the morning sun. The air was quiet, smelling faintly of leather and expensive cigars. Margaret sank into the plush seat of 3A, feeling like an imposter in a fairy tale. The other passengers, men in tailored suits and women in silk dresses, looked up with mild curiosity as Jake saw her to her seat, but no one dared say a word. Jake's presence seemed to command a silent respect that insulated her from their judgment. This is too much, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle click-clack of the wheels on the track. I can't possibly accept this. You've already done more than enough. Jake smiled and it transformed his whole face. The intensity in his eyes softened, replaced by a genuine warmth that made her stomach do a little flip. Ma'am, I've spent the last week in stuffy boardrooms talking about cattle prices. Believe me, you'd be doing me a favor by letting me enjoy the view from a different car for a while. He gestured to the empty seat across from her. May I? She nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak. As the train pulled out of Denver, the city shrinking behind them, Margaret found herself in the most surreal situation of her life. She was traveling in a level of luxury she had only ever sown for other women, all thanks to the inexplicable kindness of a total stranger. But it wasn't the velvet seat or the polished wood that had her head spinning. It was the man sitting across from her. A man who had looked at a scene of public humiliation and decided, without a moment's hesitation, to intervene. Why? The question echoed in the silence between them. A soft knock on the seat beside her made her jump. She looked up to see a woman with kind brown eyes in a stylish green traveling dress. Excuse me, the woman said with a warm smile. I hope I'm not intruding. My name is Catherine Hartwell. I was in the crowd on the platform this morning. I saw what happened. Margaret's cheeks burned. She had hoped no one in this car had witnessed her shame. That conductor was an absolute monster, Catherine continued, settling into the seat next to Margaret as if they were old friends. And that gentleman, she said, nodding at Jake, was a hero, straight out of a dime novel. She looked from Margaret to Jake with unconcealed curiosity. Are you two old friends? No, Margaret said, finding her voice. We've never met before today. Catherine's eyes widened. Never met? My dear, that is even better. A knight in shining armor, riding to the rescue of a damsel in distress. Margaret couldn't help but let out a small, humorless laugh. I think you've been reading too many romance novels, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm no damsel, and this is just a kind gesture. I'm sure Mr. She trailed off, realizing she didn't even know his name. Morrison, Jake supplied, touching the brim of his hat. Jake Morrison. And it's a pleasure to meet you both. Catherine was practically beaming. Mr. Morrison, Catherine Hartwell. I was just telling Miss Whitfield that a man doesn't do what you did for just anyone. He certainly doesn't give up his first-class accommodations for a complete stranger without a very good reason. Jake's gaze met Margaret's, and she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Amusement, perhaps, but something deeper, too. Let's just say I have a strong dislike for bullies, Mrs. Hartwell, and I have an even stronger appreciation for a woman who can face them down with grace. Margaret felt her breath catch. He had seen grace in her trembling fear. Catherine leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. You see, my dear, the man is clearly smitten. Before Margaret could protest this outrageous claim, the door between the cars opened, and a new chilling figure appeared. It was a woman Margaret recognized from the society pages of the Denver newspaper. Mrs. Eleanor Kingsley, wife of a prominent banker. She was known for her sharp tongue and her even sharper social judgments. And she was walking directly toward them. Her eyes, cold as chips of ice, were fixed on Margaret. Well, well, Mrs. Kingsley said, her voice carrying through the quiet car. It seems the Mountain Star Express has lowered its standards for first class. I must have a word with the company. The fairy tale was over. The real world had just found her. The air in the train car crackled with tension. Every passenger was now pretending not to watch, their newspapers and books held up like shields, but their ears were tuned to the drama unfolding at seat 3A. Mrs. Kingsley stood there, radiating an aura of immense wealth and profound displeasure. Her gaze raked over Margaret's homemade dress, her worn satchel, and her flushed face. It was a look designed to make a person feel small, insignificant, and utterly out of place. Margaret felt herself shrinking under that gaze, the old familiar shame washing over her. But before she could even form a response, Jake Morrison stood up. He didn't move quickly, but there was a power in his deliberate motion that made Mrs. Kingsley take a half step back. He was taller than she was, and he seemed to fill the entire aisle. Mrs. Kingsley, he said, his voice polite but with an unmistakable undertone of command. I believe you've made a mistake. Her eyes narrowed. I don't believe we've been introduced, sir. Jake Morrison, he said simply, and this is Miss Margaret Whitfield. She is my guest, and I can assure you, the standards of this car have just been raised significantly by her presence. The insult was so subtle, so perfectly delivered, that it took a moment for Mrs. Kingsley to even register it. A wave of red crept up her neck. Your guest, she sniffed, looking from Jake's rugged, handsome face to Margaret's plain, frightened one. How peculiar. Is it? Jake asked, his voice still deceptively mild. I find it far more peculiar that a woman of your standing would feel the need to publicly comment on another passenger's travel arrangements. In my experience, true class doesn't need to announce itself so loudly. A collective muffled gasp went through the car. No one spoke to Eleanor Kingsley like that. She was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She had clearly expected Jake to be some uncouth cowboy who had stumbled into money, but his speech, his bearing, the effortless way he commanded the situation, it all spoke of a different kind of power. One she wasn't used to confronting. Then Catherine Hartwell, ever the champion, stood up as well. Eleanor, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, how lovely to see you. I was just having a delightful chat with Miss Whitfield. She's a seamstress, you know, a true artist. In fact, she added, her eyes twinkling, I was just thinking that the cut of your gown is a bit dated. Perhaps you could engage Miss Whitfield for some advice on modernizing your wardrobe. It was a masterstroke. The insult was so personal, so perfectly aimed at a society woman's greatest vulnerability, that Mrs. Kingsley actually flinched. Defeated, she muttered something about needing a glass of water and beat a hasty retreat toward the dining car, the eyes of every passenger following her. The moment she was gone, the tension in the car broke. An elderly gentleman across the aisle caught Jake's eye and gave him a slow, deliberate nod of approval. Jake sat back down, and the three of them were once again in their own private bubble. Well, Catherine said with immense satisfaction, that was fun. Margaret, however, was mortified. This is a disaster, she whispered. burying her face in her hands. Now everyone on this train thinks I'm some sort of charity case he's taken pity on. Jake reached across the small table and gently touched her hand. His touch was warm and steady. "No, Margaret," he said, his voice soft. "That's not what they think. They think they just saw a man stand up for a woman he respects. There's a difference." He used her first name, Margaret. It sounded different coming from him. Solid. Real. "But why?" she asked, finally looking at him. "Why are you doing all of this? We're strangers." Jake held her gaze, and in his green eyes she saw something that looked a lot like a story waiting to be told. "My sister," he began, his voice dropping low so only she and Catherine could hear. "Her name was Rachel. She was born with a withered arm." The car seemed to fade away. It was just the three of them, and the gentle rocking of the train. "From the day she was born," Jake continued, "people treated her like she was less than whole. They'd stare. They'd whisper. Some of the crueler children would call her names. But Rachel, she was the strongest, bravest person I ever knew. She never let them see her cry. She learned to do everything with one hand better than most people could with two." He paused, a shadow of old pain crossing his face. "She died when she was 16. A fever took her in 3 days. But right before she passed, she made me promise her something. She made me promise that I would never, ever stand by and watch someone be made to feel small because they were different. She said that silence in the face of cruelty is the same as joining in." He looked at Margaret, and his eyes were full of a fierce, protective light. "When I saw that conductor talking to you on the platform, I saw every bully who ever tormented my sister. And when I saw the way you stood there, with so much dignity, trying so hard not to let him break you, I saw her. I saw Rachel." Tears were streaming down Margaret's face now, but they weren't tears of shame. They were something else entirely. "So you see," Jake said, his voice gentle again, "I'm not defending you because I feel sorry for you. I'm defending you because of a promise I made to the person I loved most in the world, and because I think she would have liked you very much." Catherine Hartwell was openly weeping. "Oh, my dear boy," she sobbed quietly. "What a beautiful story." But Margaret wasn't thinking about the story. She was thinking about the man who carried it inside him. And then, just when she thought the day could hold no more surprises, Catherine Hartwell leaned in, her eyes wide with a sudden, shocking realization. "Brennan," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "The conductor's name is Harvey Brennan." Margaret nodded, confused. "Yes, I saw it on his name tag." "Margaret," Catherine said, her hand gripping Margaret's arm, "what was the name of the man you were engaged to? The one back in Copper Creek who broke your heart?" A cold dread washed over Margaret. It couldn't be. It was impossible. "His name," she whispered, the words like ice in her mouth, "was Thomas Brennan." Catherine's face was pale. "Harvey Brennan," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "is Thomas Brennan's uncle." The world stopped. The gentle rocking of the train, the low hum of conversation, the sunlight streaming through the window. It all vanished. There was only the ringing in Margaret's ears, and Catherine Hartwell's horrifying words hanging in the air. "Harvey Brennan is Thomas Brennan's uncle." It wasn't random. The humiliation on the platform wasn't just the act of a petty tyrant with a rule book. It was personal. It was a calculated, deliberate attack. The Brennan family was still trying to hurt her, even after 3 years. A wave of nausea washed over her. She felt violated, as if a private, painful part of her past had been dragged out and put on public display. Jake saw the color drain from her face. "Margaret, what is it? What's wrong?" She couldn't speak. She just shook her head, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Thomas, the man who had called her a liability to his banking career. The man who had dissected her appearance, her personality, her very being, and found them wanting. His uncle had recognized her name on the passenger list and had decided to finish the job his nephew had started. To publicly shame her and drive her away. It was a setup, Catherine breathed, her own face a mask of outrage. That vile little man. He knew who you were all along. This was his way of getting revenge on behalf of his loathsome nephew. Revenge for what? Jake demanded, his voice low and dangerous. What did Margaret ever do to them? Margaret finally found her voice, though it was a raw, broken whisper. I existed. I wasn't the right kind of wife for an ambitious banker. I was an embarrassment. He told me so himself. She looked at Jake, her eyes pleading for him to understand. This is why I was going home. To see my sister get married. To pretend, just for a weekend, that I was a normal person. But they won't even let me have that. The gossip, the judgment, it follows me everywhere. Jake's jaw was tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He looked like he was about to get up and march through the train until he found Harvey Brennan. Don't, Margaret said, putting a hand on his arm. Please, it will only make things worse. You've done enough. Enough? He said, his voice rough with anger. Margaret, this isn't just a rude conductor anymore. This is a conspiracy to cause you pain. This is a family of bullies who think they can treat people like dirt and get away with it. He took a deep breath, visibly trying to control his temper. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. When you told me about Thomas before, I thought he was just a fool, a weak man who broke your heart. But this is different. This is malicious. This is evil. The train whistle blew, a long, mournful sound that echoed the ache in Margaret's soul. They were pulling into a small station to take on water. Through the window, she could see a cluster of wooden buildings huddled against the vast empty plains. We'll be stopping for 20 minutes, Jake said. I'm going to go stretch my legs. He stood up, but before he walked away, he looked down at her, his green eyes blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. This isn't over, Margaret. I promise you that. As he strode out of the car, Catherine Hartwell turned to Margaret, her own eyes full of a new, fierce determination. He's in love with you, you know. Margaret shook her head. He's just being kind. He feels sorry for me. It's because of his sister, Rachel. Oh, stop it, Catherine said, with the impatience of a dear friend. Rachel's story may be why he stepped forward, but it is not why he is staying. Did you see the look on his face when you told him about the Brennans? That was not the look of a man fulfilling a promise to his dead sister. That was the look of a man who wants to tear down the world for the woman he loves. She patted Margaret's hand. My dear, you have stumbled into something far more powerful than a simple act of kindness. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Margaret watched Jake through the window. He was standing on the platform, not stretching his legs, but talking to the station master, gesturing back toward the train. He was a man of action, a man who saw a problem and immediately started looking for a solution. He was everything Thomas Brennan was not. He was everything she had never dared to dream of. When Jake returned, he was carrying a small, clumsy bouquet of wildflowers. He must have picked them from the side of the tracks during the brief stop. I thought these might brighten the car a little, he said, handing them to her. His knuckles were slightly scraped. No man had ever given her flowers before. Not once. She took them, her fingers trembling. They're beautiful, she whispered. Thank you. He settled back into his seat, a thoughtful expression on his face. I had a chat with the station master, he said, his voice casual. Interesting fellow. He's also the telegraph operator for this region. Margaret looked at him, a flicker of suspicion dawning. Jake, what did you do? I just sent a couple of telegrams, he said with a shrug. One to my foreman at the ranch, letting him know I might be a day or two later than planned, and one to the head office of the Mountain Star Express Railroad in Omaha. Her eyes widened. What did you say? Oh, nothing much, he said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. Just a brief inquiry. I asked them to confirm if it was official company policy for their conductors to engage in personal vendettas against the fiancés of their major beef suppliers. I also asked for clarification on their nepotism policies, specifically regarding the employment of conductors whose nephews have been recently fired from their banking positions for embezzlement. Margaret's jaw dropped. Embezzlement? Thomas? Jake's smile widened. It seems my business associates in Denver know quite a bit about the financial world, and the name Thomas Brennan came up in a rather interesting conversation last week. Apparently, his departure from the bank wasn't as quiet as his family had hoped. He didn't just break your heart, Margaret. He broke the law. The train lurched forward, pulling away from the station and continuing its journey north. Margaret stared at the man across from her, a man she had met only a few hours ago. A man who had not only defended her, comforted her, and given her flowers, but had now, with a single, swift action, begun to dismantle the very foundation of her pain. He hadn't just stood up to a bully. He had started a war on her behalf. The revelation about Thomas hung in the air between them, a stunning, world-altering truth. Thomas wasn't just a cruel fiancé. He was a criminal, a thief. The humiliation he had heaped upon her wasn't about her unsuitability at all. It was a smokescreen. He had likely needed to end the engagement quickly, to sever ties before his world came crashing down, and he had used her as a scapegoat. Her shame, the heavy cloak she had worn for 3 long years, began to feel thin and threadbare. It wasn't her shame at all. It was his. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. "How could you have possibly known to ask about that?" Jake's expression was serious. Men like Thomas Brennan, men who are cruel to people they're supposed to care about, are rarely cruel in just one area of their lives. The weakness, the dishonesty. It spreads. I took a guess. It seems I guessed right. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He tried to make you feel worthless, Margaret, to cover up his own worthlessness. What he did to you was a lie. All of it. For the first time in 3 years, she believed it. She felt a lightness in her chest, a profound sense of release, as if a heavy chain had just snapped. Catherine Hartwell, who had been listening with rapt attention, finally spoke. "Well," she declared, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, "I believe this calls for a celebration. I'm going to the dining car and ordering the best bottle of champagne they have, and you two are joining me." As Catherine swept away on her mission, Margaret and Jake were left alone again. The silence was different now. It was filled not with questions, but with a new, fragile understanding. "Jake," she said softly, her eyes locked on his, "the things you've done for me today, no one has ever stood up for me like that. No one has ever believed in me like that." "Then they were all fool," he said simply. "It's the easiest thing in the world to believe in you." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, bathing the car in a warm golden light. As the train raced through the vast open country, Margaret felt like she was racing toward a future she couldn't have imagined just that morning. But the journey wasn't over, and the biggest shock was yet to come. As night fell, the mood in the first-class car was subdued. The champagne with Mrs. Hartwell had been a small island of joy in a sea of emotional turmoil. Now, as the train crossed into Wyoming territory, a deep exhaustion had settled over Margaret. She declined Jake's invitation to dinner, needing time alone to process everything she had learned. She sat in the darkness, watching her own ghostly reflection in the window as the landscape rushed by. She was a different woman than the one who had boarded this train. The shame was gone, replaced by a slow-burning anger and a new, unfamiliar sense of her own strength. A little while later, Jake returned from the dining car. He didn't sit down but stood in the aisle by her seat, his expression troubled. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low. "I don't want you to hear it from someone else." A knot of apprehension formed in her stomach. "What is it?" "I ran into Harvey Brennan near the galley. The telegraph from Omaha had already reached the train at the last stop. They're ordering him to disembark at the next station. He's been suspended, pending a full investigation. He's lost his job, Margaret." She had expected to feel a sense of triumph, of justice served. Instead, she just felt empty. "And?" she prompted, sensing there was more. "He was drunk," Jake said, his jaw tight, "and he was angry. He said some things. Things about you, about Copper Creek." "What did he say?" Jake hesitated, clearly reluctant to repeat the man's venom. "He said that you shouldn't be so quick to go home. He said that the Brennans have long memories. He said that Thomas isn't the only one in town who feels the way he does. He bragged that the whole town had turned against you after the engagement ended. He called you. He said the town called you Brennan's burden." The ugly words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had known people whispered. She had felt the pitying stares, But she had never imagined they had given her a name, a brand. All the newfound strength she had felt seemed to evaporate, leaving her feeling as raw and vulnerable as she had on the platform that morning. "So, it's true," she whispered. "Everyone back home? They hate me." "No," Jake said fiercely, finally sitting down across from her, his knees almost touching hers. He took her hands in his grip firm and reassuring. "That's the lie of a bitter, broken man. Don't you let him poison you with it." "But what if it's not a lie?" she cried, the tears she had held back all day finally coming. "What if I get off this train and walk right back into the same nightmare I ran away from? What if nothing has changed?" Jake was silent for a long moment, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Then don't go back," he said. She looked at him, confused. "What?" "Don't go back to a life that doesn't deserve you," he said, his green eyes burning into hers. "Margaret, I know this is going to sound insane. I know we've only known each other for a day. But in that day, I've seen more strength, more grace, and more courage in you than I've seen in anyone in my entire life." Her heart started to pound, a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. "I have a ranch in Colorado," he went on, his voice a low, intense rush. 20,000 acres of the most beautiful land you've ever seen, and a house that's far too big and far too empty for one person. It needs a heart. It needs you." He leaned closer, his face just inches from hers. "I'm not asking you to be my guest anymore, Margaret. I'm asking you to be my partner. My wife." The word hung in the air, electric and impossible. "Marry me, Margaret," he whispered. "Come with me to Colorado. Leave the Brennans and their miserable little town in the past where they belong. Start a new life. With me." She stared at him, utterly speechless. Her mind was a whirlwind of shock, of disbelief, of a wild, terrifying hope that was so bright it hurt to look at. This stranger, this cowboy, this avenging angel on a train, wasn't just offering her a defense. He was offering her a whole new world. The proposal, as stunning and impossible as it was, hung between them. Margaret couldn't form words. Her entire life, men had looked at her and seen a problem to be solved, a flaw to be overlooked, or an object of pity. No one had ever looked at her and seen a future. "Jake, you don't even know me," she finally managed to stammer. "I know everything I need to know," he said, his voice unwavering. "I know you're kind. I know you're talented. I saw the dress you made. I know you're brave. You faced down that conductor, and you faced down Mrs. Kingsley. I know you have a heart big enough to care about a sister who lives 1,000 miles away. What else is there?" I'm I'm not the kind of woman a man like you marries," she said, the old insecurities whispering their poisonous lies. "I'm plain. I'm large. I'm a seamstress with no family and no money." His grip on her hands tightened. "Stop. Don't you ever talk about yourself that way again. The woman I see is beautiful. The woman I see is strong. The woman I see is the only woman I want to build a life with. The rest is just noise." The sincerity in his voice was a physical force. It pushed back against the years of self-doubt, against the cruel words of Thomas and the cold stares of strangers. "You don't have to answer me now," he said gently, seeing the turmoil in her eyes. "Just think about it. Just consider the possibility that this crazy, impossible thing might be the sanest choice you could ever make." She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window watching the moonlit plains of Wyoming fly by, Jake's proposal echoing in her mind. Marry him? Move to Colorado? Abandon her plans, her trip, her entire former life, based on a single day's acquaintance? It was madness. Utter, complete madness. And yet, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren ground of her heart. What if he was right? What if this was her one chance to escape the ghosts of her past and step into a future she had never been brave enough to imagine for herself? The next morning, as the train rumbled into Montana, the landscape began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling foothills, the distant jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains looming on the horizon. It was the country of her childhood, and the sight of it filled her with a familiar ache. She found Jake in the dining car, nursing a cup of coffee. She sat down across from him, her heart pounding. "I've thought about your offer," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He waited, his expression unreadable. "It's the most beautiful, most generous, most insane thing anyone has ever said to me," she continued. "And I need to be honest with you. The idea of it terrifies me." A flicker of disappointment crossed his face, but he masked it quickly. "I understand." "But," she said, taking a deep breath, "the idea of saying no, of getting off this train in Copper Creek, going back to my old life, and watching you ride away forever, that terrifies me even more." A slow smile spread across his face, a sunrise after a long night. "Is that a yes, Margaret Whitfield?" It's a maybe," she said, a shy smile of her own touching her lips. "It's a, let me see my sister get married, and then ask me again when my head isn't spinning." He laughed, a deep, warm sound that filled the car. "That's the best maybe I've ever heard." But their private moment was interrupted by a new commotion. Harvey Brennan, his face puffy and red, his uniform disheveled, was storming through the train car. He was no longer a man in authority. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and he was heading straight for them. "You!" he snarled, his voice thick with whiskey and rage as he stopped at their table. He pointed a trembling finger at Jake. "You cost me my job. 32 years of service gone because of you and this fat cow." The entire dining car fell silent. The ugly word hung in the air like a foul smoke. Margaret flinched as if he'd struck her. All the progress, all the hope of the last 24 hours seemed to crumble to dust. Jake was on his feet in an instant, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. His face was a thundercloud. "You need to leave. Now," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm not going anywhere until I've had my say." Brennan shouted, his voice cracking. "She ruined my nephew's life, and now she's ruined mine. She's a curse, that's what she is. A curse on the Brennan name." Just then, another figure appeared, stepping between Brennan and their table. It was the elderly, distinguished gentleman who had nodded at Jake the day before. "Conductor," the man said, his voice calm but carrying an immense weight of authority, "I believe you've said quite enough. In fact, I believe you've just committed slander against a passenger, in addition to being drunk and disorderly on duty. I should know. I'm Judge William Crawford, and I am placing you under citizen's arrest until we reach the next station, where the sheriff will be waiting for you." Harvey Brennan's jaw dropped. His drunken rage evaporated, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed fear. The judge turned to Margaret, his eyes kind. "Miss," he said, "I apologize on behalf of all civilized people on this train. No one should be subjected to such vile behavior." He then nodded to Jake. "And you, sir, are a gentleman. It's a rare quality these days." As two burly porters escorted the now sobbing Harvey Brennan away, Margaret looked at Jake, and then at the judge, and then at the other passengers who were now looking at her, not with pity, but with respect. The world was changing. Or maybe she was the one who was changing. An hour later, the train pulled into the small station at Willow Creek, 2 stops before Copper Creek. A young woman with a friendly face was waiting on the platform. "Margaret," the woman called out, "is that you? It's me, Sarah Mitchell. Well, Sarah Harper now. Emma sent me to meet you." It was a friend from her school days, as Sarah chattered away, explaining that her buggy was waiting to take them the rest of the way. Margaret's heart began to pound with a new, terrifying thought. Her maybe was about to be put to the test. In less than an hour, she would be back in Copper Creek. She would be standing face to face with her past. And Jake would be continuing on his way to Colorado. As they stepped off the train, Sarah looked curiously at Jake. "And who is this?" "This is Jake Morrison," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. A friend from the train." "Well, Mr. Morrison," Sarah said brightly, "if you're not in a hurry, you should come with us to Copper Creek. The whole town is celebrating Emma's wedding. You can't miss it." Margaret held her breath. This was it, the moment of truth. Jake looked at Sarah, then his eyes moved to Margaret. He held her gaze for a long, heart-stopping moment. I wouldn't miss it for the world, he said. The buggy ride to Copper Creek was a strange journey through time. As they bounced along the familiar dusty road, Sarah Harper pointed out all the changes. A new barn here, a sold-off pasture there, while Margaret felt herself being pulled back into the life she had fled. Jake rode a rented horse beside them, a silent, imposing figure against the vast Montana sky. His presence was both a comfort and a source of incredible tension. What was she doing, bringing this man, this stranger who had proposed to her, into the heart of her past? Oh, and you'll never guess, Sarah chattered on. The old Brennan house was finally sold last spring. A new family from back east bought it. The Brennans? Margaret asked, her voice tight. I thought they were still in town. Sarah shot her a quick, pitying look. Oh, honey, no. They left town not 6 months after you did. Thomas's father lost a fortune in some bad investment. They packed up and moved to Billings overnight. It was a huge scandal. Thomas works for some other bank there now. Margaret processed this in stunned silence. All this time she had pictured them in Copper Creek, living their lives, judging her from afar. But they were gone. The central villains of her story had already exited the stage, except their poison remained. Brennan's burden. The name echoed in her head. As they crested the final hill, Copper Creek came into view, nestled in the valley below. The white steeple of the church, the cluster of wooden buildings along Main Street. It was exactly as she remembered, a perfect, painful photograph of her past. Home, Sarah said softly. But it didn't feel like home. It felt like a trap. As they drove down Main Street, heads turned. Faces appeared in shop windows. The town was just as she remembered, small, watchful, and hungry for gossip. The sight of Margaret Whitfield, who had left under a cloud of shame, returning with a handsome, mysterious stranger on the eve of her sister's wedding, was more than they could have hoped for. Margaret Rose Whitfield, is that you? A voice boomed from the porch of the general store. It was Mrs. Campbell, the town's unofficial gossip-in-chief. Her eyes darted from Margaret to Jake and back again, practically buzzing with questions. Margaret forced a smile. Hello, Mrs. Campbell. It's good to see you. You look sophisticated, Mrs. Campbell said, as if it were a strange medical condition. And who is this fine gentleman? Before Margaret could answer, a new figure appeared, stepping out of the doctor's office. Her heart lurched. It was Dr. Marcus Hendricks. He had been a kind friend before her engagement, a quiet, thoughtful man she had always liked. He had aged well, his face now carrying a handsome maturity. Margaret, he said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. He walked right up to the buggy and took her hand. Welcome home. You look wonderful. Marcus, she said, her mind reeling. It's so good to see you. His eyes flickered to Jake, a hint of polite curiosity mixing with something else. Something that looked like competition. I don't believe we've met. Margaret made the introductions, her voice feeling stiff and unnatural. The two men shook hands, their grips firm, their gazes sizing each other up. It was a classic small-town standoff, and she was standing right in the middle of it. Then just as the silence became unbearable, there was a cry from down the street. Margaret! It was Emma. She was flying toward them on her horse, her golden hair streaming behind her. She leaped from the saddle before the horse had even stopped and threw herself at the buggy, hugging Margaret with a fierce, desperate joy. You're here! You're really here! Emma cried, her face buried in Margaret's shoulder. Margaret hugged her back, a wave of pure, uncomplicated love washing away some of the tension. I told you I wouldn't miss it. Emma pulled back, her eyes shining. Then her gaze fell on Jake. Her jaw dropped. She looked at Jake, then at Marcus, then back at Margaret, her eyes wide with shock and dawning delight. Margaret Rose Whitfield, she whispered, her voice filled with mischievous glee. What in the world have you done? She then turned her brilliant smile on Jake. You must be the suitor, she declared loudly for all the listening ears on Main Street to hear. I'm Emma. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. My sister has written me so much about you." It was a complete and utter lie. Margaret had never mentioned Jake in a single letter. Jake, to his credit, didn't even blink. He simply tipped his hat. "The pleasure is all mine, Miss Emma, and everything your sister wrote about your beauty and charm did not do you justice." Emma positively beamed. Dr. Marcus, however, looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. Margaret felt like she was trapped in a play where everyone but her knew the lines. Her little sister, the small-town doctor, the mysterious stranger. They were all circling around her, and the entire town of Copper Creek had a front-row seat. Her quiet homecoming had just turned into a three-ring circus, and in the center ring, a new, terrifying player was about to make his entrance. As Emma led the chaotic procession to the boarding house, a man stepped out of the hotel across the street. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his hair slicked back. He was heavier than she remembered, his face puffier, but the arrogant tilt of his head was unmistakable. Margaret's blood ran cold. It was Thomas Brennan. He wasn't in Billings. He was here. Sarah Harper's news, the story of his family's disgrace and departure, it was all wrong. Thomas Brennan stood on the steps of the Copper Creek Hotel, a smug, self-satisfied smirk on his face, watching her. The world seemed to warp around Margaret. The cheerful chatter of her sister, the concerned look from Jake, the curious stares of the townspeople. It all faded into a dull roar. There was only Thomas, his presence a dark blot on the bright afternoon. He saw her looking. His smirk widened. He gave a small, mocking nod and then disappeared back inside the hotel. "Margaret, are you all right?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," Emma said, her hand on her sister's arm. "The Brennans," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "They're still here. Thomas is here." Emma's cheerful expression dissolved, replaced by a look of pure guilt. "Oh, Maggie," she said, using her childhood nickname. "I'm so sorry. I lied in my letters. They never left. I was just so afraid that if you knew he was still here, you wouldn't come home. I couldn't bear the thought of getting married without you." The confession, meant to be loving, felt like a betrayal. Emma hadn't trusted her. She had treated her like a fragile child who needed to be protected from the truth. Tears of anger and hurt pricked at Margaret's eyes. She felt Jake's presence beside her, a solid wall of quiet strength. He had seen Thomas too. He understood. "Let's get you inside," he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. He gently guided her toward the boarding house, creating a barrier between her and the prying eyes of the town. Inside, the chaos only intensified. The boarding house was filled with relatives and friends, all eager to greet Margaret. She was hugged, kissed, and exclaimed over, all while her mind was screaming. Thomas was here. What did he want? Why now? That evening, a pre-wedding dinner was held at the Harper family ranch. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but for Margaret, it was an exercise in pure terror. Every time the door opened, she expected to see him walk in. She sat between Jake and Emma, picking at her food, unable to join in the laughter and toasts. Jake never left her side. He kept a steadying hand on her arm, refilled her water glass, and deflected questions with an easy charm that belied the tension coiled in his shoulders. Dr. Marcus watched them from across the room, his expression a mixture of concern and disappointment. He tried to approach her once, but Jake, without being overtly rude, made it clear that she was not to be disturbed. After dinner, as guests mingled on the porch, Emma pulled Margaret aside. "I am so sorry, Maggie," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "I was wrong to lie. I see that now. Can you ever forgive me?" Looking at her sister's distraught face, Margaret's anger melted away, leaving only a deep, weary sadness. "Of course I forgive you," she said, hugging her. "You were just trying to protect me." "He's a guest at the wedding," Emma admitted, her voice muffled against Margaret's shoulder. "His new fiancée is a distant cousin of the Harpers. David couldn't get out of inviting them without causing a huge family rift. I hoped you'd never even have to see him." A new fiancé. The news was another small, sharp sting. Just then, David Harper, Emma's kind and steady groom-to-be, approached them. "Ladies," he said, a worried frown on his face, "there's Someone here who insists on speaking with Margaret. Margaret's heart plummeted. She turned, and there he was. Thomas Brennan walking toward her across the manicured lawn of the Harper Ranch, a look of insufferable arrogance on his face. Jake materialized at her side instantly, stepping slightly in front of her. "That's not going to happen," he said to David. But Margaret put a hand on Jake's arm. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "It's all right. I need to do this." She had spent 3 years running from this man, running from the shame he had heaped on her. But she wasn't that same woman anymore. The woman who had boarded the train in Denver would have hidden. But this woman had faced down a conductor, a society shrew, and a drunken mob. She would not hide from a common thief. She stepped out from behind Jake, her head held high. Thomas stopped a few feet from her. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her simple dress. "Margaret," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "you look, well, the years have been kind." "I can't say the same for you, Thomas," she replied, her voice as cold and clear as ice. "I hear banking is a stressful profession." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I came to offer my congratulations on your new companion," he said, flicking his gaze dismissively toward Jake. "It's good to see you found someone. I always worried about you." The condescension, the sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. "You never worried about me," she said calmly. "You worried about yourself. You worried your crimes would be discovered, and you needed a way out. So you tried to destroy me to save yourself." He actually laughed. My, you've developed a flair for the dramatic. Crimes, don't be ridiculous. Our engagement ended because we weren't suited. It's as simple as that." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But let me give you some friendly advice. This cowboy of yours, men like him are a dime a dozen. Don't let yourself get too attached. A woman in your position can't afford to be picky, of course, but you should still try to have some standards." That was it. The dam broke. "My standards," she said, her voice rising, drawing the attention of the nearby guests. "Let me tell you about my standards, Thomas. I require a man to be honest. I require him to be kind. I require him to have a backbone. In short, I require him to be everything you are not." She took a step closer, forcing him to take a step back. "You tried to break me. You and your family. You tried to humiliate me and brand me. You wanted me to disappear, to live out my life in shame. Well, look at me, Thomas. I'm still here, and I am not ashamed." The party had gone silent. Everyone was watching. "And this man," she said, turning and taking Jake's hand, her fingers lacing with his. "This cowboy, as you call him, he saw my worth in a single afternoon, something you couldn't see in 10 years. He is 10 times the man you will ever be. And he didn't just propose marriage to me, Thomas. He proposed a partnership, an equal." She turned back to a stunned Thomas Brennan. "So you can take your friendly advice and your pity and your pathetic attempts to hurt me, and you can crawl back into whatever hole you slithered out of. You have no power over me anymore." She squeezed Jake's hand, turned her back on her speechless ex-fiancé, and walked away, leaving the entire wedding party staring in stunned, silent admiration. The battle was over, and for the first time in her life, Margaret Whitfield had won. The wedding day was a beautiful, surreal dream. Emma was a radiant bride, David a nervous but adoring groom. The little church in Copper Creek was filled to overflowing with flowers and sunlight and the happy buzz of the entire community. Margaret stood beside her sister, her heart full of a quiet, fierce joy. The confrontation with Thomas the night before had been a catharsis. The whispers and stares of the townspeople had transformed overnight. They no longer looked at her with pity, but with a newfound respect. She wasn't Brennan's burden anymore. She was the woman who had faced down her tormentor and won. During the ceremony, she caught Jake's eye. He was standing in the back watching her. He wasn't smiling. He was just looking at her with an expression of such profound love and pride that it made her breath catch in her throat. In that moment she knew. Her maybe was gone. Her fear was gone. There was only the quiet, unshakable certainty of her own heart. The answer was yes. At the reception, held in a large decorated barn on the Harper Ranch, the mood was jubilant. Margaret was surrounded by well-wishers, people who had known her as a shy, awkward girl, and were now congratulating her on her courage. But there was still a dark cloud on the horizon. Thomas Brennan and his fiancée were there, lurking at the edge of the celebration like vultures. Thomas was drinking heavily, his face a mask of sullen fury. Margaret knew it wasn't over. A man like Thomas couldn't stand to be publicly humiliated. He would have to retaliate. She found Jake by the punch bowl. "He's going to do something," she said quietly. "I can feel it." "Let him," Jake said, his voice calm. "He's just a cornered snake. All he has left is venom." The moment came during the toast. After the best man had given a heartfelt speech, Thomas Brennan, his face flushed with alcohol, pushed his way to the front of the room. "I'd like to propose a toast," he announced, his words slightly slurred. The room went quiet. He raised his glass. "To the happy couple and to Margaret Whitfield." He turned to her, a cruel smirk on his face. "Who has done so well for herself? It's truly inspiring to see a woman of her limited prospects manage to snag such a fine specimen of a man, even if he is just a simple cattle rancher. I'm sure your life in a dusty shack in the middle of nowhere will be very rustic." The insult was aimed at Jake, but it was meant to wound her, to remind her of her place. Jake didn't move. He just watched Thomas with a look of cool detachment. But someone else did move. Judge William Crawford, the distinguished gentleman from the train, who had been an honored guest at the wedding, stepped forward. "Mr. Brennan," the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of a courtroom, "I find your toast to be in exceptionally poor taste, but I find your assessment of Mr. Morrison's prospects to be even more misinformed." Thomas looked at the judge, confused. "I don't know who you are, old man, but this is a private—" "I am Judge William Crawford," he said, cutting him off, "and I have had the pleasure of knowing the Morrison family of Boston for many years. A very distinguished family. Old money. Shipping, textiles, and more recently, banking." A confused murmur went through the crowd. The judge continued, his eyes fixed on Thomas. "So you can imagine my surprise when I learned that Jake here had abandoned a promising career in law to pursue his passion for ranching out west. A very, very successful passion, I might add. His JM Ranch is one of the largest and most profitable operations in the entire Colorado Territory." The judge paused, letting his words sink in. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow. "He is also," the judge said, his voice ringing with satisfaction, "a silent partner and a majority shareholder in the Western Consolidated Bank of Denver, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the very institution that recently acquired the small, struggling bank in Billings that currently holds your employment contract." The color drained from Thomas Brennan's face. He looked at Jake, his mouth agape, a look of pure, unadulterated horror in his eyes. Jake wasn't just a cowboy. He wasn't just a rancher. He was, for all intents and purposes, Thomas Brennan's boss. A slow, wicked grin spread across Jake's face. He raised his own glass. "To new business ventures," he said, his eyes locking with Thomas's. "I do look forward to reviewing your performance reports." Thomas stood there for a moment, utterly broken, and then he turned and practically fled from the barn, his fiancée trailing behind him. A moment of stunned silence was followed by a roar of laughter and applause that shook the rafters. In the midst of the celebration, Margaret walked up to Jake. She looked into his smiling, handsome face, the face of the man who had changed her entire world. "Is that a yes, Margaret Whitfield?" he had asked her that morning. She stood on her toes and kissed him, right there in front of the whole town. "It's a yes, Jake Morrison," she said, her voice ringing with a joy so pure it felt like flying. "It's the biggest yes of my life." Emma, who had seen everything, let out a squeal of pure delight. "Pastor Williams!" she shouted across the barn. "Don't go anywhere. I think we're having another wedding." And in a whirlwind of laughter, tears, and borrowed rings, with the entire town of Copper Creek as their witness, Margaret Rose Whitfield married Jake Morrison, not even 72 hours after they had first laid eyes on each other. It was madness. It was impossible. And it was the most perfect thing that had ever happened. Their departure the next morning was a town-wide event. It seemed every citizen of Copper Creek came to see them off, to wish them well, and to press small gifts into their hands. Jars of preserves, a hand-sewn quilt, a bag of horse feed. Margaret, who had arrived feeling like an outcast, was leaving as a beloved daughter, a local legend. Emma hugged her goodbye, tears streaming down her face. "Write to me every day," she sobbed. "Tell me everything." "I will," Margaret promised, her own tears flowing freely. Dr. Marcus shook Jake's hand, a look of genuine respect on his face. "You take care of her," he said. "She's one of a kind." "I know," Jake said simply. As they climbed into the sturdy wagon Jake had purchased, Margaret looked out at the sea of friendly faces. She had come home to face her past, and in doing so, she had discovered a future she never knew was possible. The journey to Colorado was a honeymoon on wheels. They traveled through breathtaking mountain passes and wide, sun-drenched valleys. They talked for hours, sharing stories, dreams, and secrets, filling in the gaps of their whirlwind courtship. And in the quiet moments, in the shared glances across a campfire, a deep and abiding love took root, stronger than any she had ever imagined. Days later, they crested a final ridge, and Jake pulled the wagon to a stop. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morrison," he said softly. Below them, nestled in a valley so green and beautiful it made her ache, was the J.M. Ranch. A long, sturdy log house sat beside a rushing stream, surrounded by barns, corrals, and pastures dotted with hundreds of cattle. It wasn't a dusty shack. It was a kingdom. As they rode down into the valley, a dozen or so cowboys came out to meet them, their faces weathered and curious. A grizzled foreman stepped forward. "Boss," he said, tipping his hat, "we weren't expecting you back so soon." Jake jumped down from the wagon and then turned to help Margaret down, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. "Boys," Jake announced, his voice booming with pride as he put his arm around her. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Margaret." A moment of stunned silence was followed by a chorus of whoops and cheers. The cowboys surrounded them, shaking Jake's hand, tipping their hats to Margaret, their faces split in wide, welcoming grins. That evening, Jake and Margaret stood on the wide porch of their new home, watching the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, a feeling of peace settling over her, so deep and profound it felt like it had been waiting for her whole life. She thought of the woman who had boarded the train in Denver, a woman so convinced of her own worthlessness that she had almost allowed a cruel man to deny her a trip home. It felt like a lifetime ago. That woman had been invisible, even to herself. But the woman standing on this porch, wrapped in the arms of a man who adored her, looking out over a future as vast and beautiful as the land before her, this woman was finally, completely, gloriously visible. Her journey had started with a single, hateful finger pointed in her direction, but it had ended here, in a place of infinite possibility, with a loving hand held firmly in her own. It just goes to show you, sometimes the worst day of your life is actually the first day of your real life. If you enjoyed this story, you're going to love the one I've picked out for you next. It's right there on your screen. And please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It means the world to us, and it ensures you never miss another story. Thanks for watching.